city and local government networks and the UN system through what we call the Local 2030 movement to try to develop a local level data platform. It's a good start, but we need to raise awareness about the importance of this work and strengthen that local level data revolution. We also need to look at finance at the local level. Local governments continue to face difficulties accessing finance and have limited capacities to raise their own. Lifting these barriers will be critical to accelerating the SDGs implementation. There's massive investment potential in the SDGs and climate action by local governments, like states and provinces. For climate change alone, the investment opportunities in cities today, we've got estimates that are more than $29 trillion by 2030. But these opportunities will go to waste because currently the global financial architecture is designed with national governments and large companies in mind rather than the community-level interactions and investments that are essential for the SDGs implementation. Without the ability to raise their own capital, small towns and cities struggle to finance the new infrastructure that is aligned with SDG implementation, from low-emission housing to improved water, sanitation systems, and climate mitigation measures. And here, I'd say we do have the opportunity of leapfrogging. We don't have to go through the same cycles that previous governments and communities have. We can take the technological advances and use them to leapfrog. But that too needs investments, and it needs it yesterday. We should also look closely to the SDG review mechanisms at local level. Accountability is going to be essential if we're to engage with new partners who require regulatory frameworks and demonstrable results. So here again, the lowest tier of government is the least trusted when you come to talk to investors. In fact, even governments, where the first investments start, trust least the local level where capacities are not so strong and governance challenges abound. There are, however, good practice, and I think that that's what we need to speak to, is a glass that is some full as we try to fill the rest of it. The city of Freetown in Sierra Leone is planning to develop a voluntary local review, committing to advance the 17 goals, evaluating their efforts and empowering stakeholders. Mexico City, for one, has launched a green municipal bond and established a climate change fund. We need to learn from some of these, build on them, and if in the next few years we can do so, then we should be able to see real progress in reporting those results. And perhaps here for all of that, that local level action needs really to rest on the able shoulders of our young people. The second reflection I'd like to highlight is public mobilization. So moving from young people, SDGs are an agenda for and certainly by people, yet most people across the world are still not really aware of the goals. Formal engagement and events are essential, and really that's why we're here today, to try to socialize further the importance of this framework that we believe is an answer to many of the headwinds that we face on the global stage. So we need to take goals beyond formal frameworks, engage ordinary people and the global public in the communities that they live and that they work and that they learn. We need to rethink how to communicate the goals. We need the stories that resonate and connect to challenges people experience daily in their lives so that when you see a policy, it has to be rooted in a reality. We need to navigate the new media landscape with an eye on the values and the information needed to inspire change. And we need to find the right messengers and influencers to reach new audiences. We also need to energize and empower young people so that they can leverage their agency, their networks, and their command of new technologies to take up the fight for the Sustainable Development Goals. As we see around the climate crisis, young people are incredible agents of change, shifting consumer behavior, demanding political leadership, and building movement upon movement from local to national to global. In September alone, we estimated 6 million people took to the streets around the world to call for more climate action, and hundreds and thousands have joined since then, the majority of which are our young people. A comparable mass global movement and engagement is needed if really the decade of action is to carry and deliver the transformative change that we want to 16 more of those goals, remembering that climate action is one of the 17. We can see the beginnings in the demonstrations that have taken place in the past few months. Many people have clearly had enough of the status quo, whether in terms of inequality, gender-based violence, or simply corruption. Digital technology and social media mean people are now more aware than ever before of their human rights, their fundamental freedoms, and of the injustices and inequalities that they face every day. The 2030 Agenda is a way to channel these frustrations, these concerns, this anger into transformative actions, into sustainable growth that benefits people, communities, and especially the planet. Third opportunity for moving from policy to impact is by tackling the SDG challenges in a truly integrated manner. That's really what the framework was trying to do, was to bring those three pillars together, the social, the environmental, and the economic piece together. Too often, the emphasis on advancing an integrated approach has failed to move beyond that rhetoric because it's hard work. It means that we have to rethink the things that we do. And when we say to change the way we do things, we do have to flip the orthodoxies in many a case. Leaders and decision makers would need to analyze and address the trade-offs and the synergies that come from their decisions, implications of their policies and the interventions. For example, addressing hunger, the SDG 2, requires a sustainable food system that balances the need for ensuring universal access to nutritious foods and greater food security, with reducing emissions and pressures on water resources and biodiversity. We can only move towards such an approach by establishing the partnerships with the relevant actors across these systems and sectors, shifting processes and priorities at scale and in a much more coordinated way, and holding each other to account as we do so. The next phase of SDG implementation demands that the level of integration must be across a range of these challenges, but in very many constituencies, those that form the policies, those that will implement them, but even our parliamentarians that sit in different committees that need to pass appropriations and budgets for them. The fourth reflection would be from moving from the rhetoric of the imperative of leaving no one behind. If there was anything, perhaps, that we could say we did justice to in this SDG framework, was that core of it, the human rights piece that says everyone is entitled to their aspirations, hope, and a prosperous and free future. And therefore, that leaving no one behind makes it incumbent upon each and every one of us in whatever we do to ask first, who are those no ones, and what can we do to make sure they're up front first? Yesterday, I had the pleasure of addressing the Doha International Conference on Disability and Development. We know that people with disabilities are all too often left out and left behind, the most vulnerable and the least able to make their voices heard. At the conference, governments and the UN system, academia, the private sector, and other key organizations came together to exchange ideas and learn from each other's experience of investing in the inclusion and agency for people with disabilities. Efforts to include people with special needs, refugees and migrants, people in humanitarian crises, the elderly, those subjected to discrimination of all kinds, will be a litmus test for the success of the SDGs. We'll need clear benchmarks to reach these vulnerable groups in all the sustainable development planning. And we have many targets and a lot of indicators, but that's at the global level. They need to be brought down into our lives and into the realities of the impact that we need to make in each of our communities. So developing new programs will need to ensure that we are doing this for all. We need to invest in data. I said at the beginning one of those two issues was data and finance, but the data systems really need to be robust. They need to be disaggregated. They really need to point out where those gaps are and people are falling through the cracks. It'll certainly be seen in the impact of our policies, our interventions, the solutions, and the financing that are made. It'll mean changing the policy and legal frameworks in many cases that will reinforce outdated systems and excluding certain people and groups. Such measures can have an enormous impact across the goals, and we need to do this urgently. In Mexico City and Guadalajara, the public transport system has been made more accessible to people with disabilities by adding elevators and providing information in Braille. These simple changes have helped people with disabilities access education, healthcare, jobs, and leaving no one behind means just that. I think often we need to put ourselves in the shoes of those that we are trying to represent and to make sure they're not left behind. I experienced a few months ago having a broken foot trying to get round the United Nations. And here we were with conventions and frameworks that were saying, leave no one behind. And I really couldn't get behind the podium to give my speech on many an occasion. Worse still, finding that perhaps on some days, one would not be able to get out of the UN building just because the turnstile was too small for a wheelchair. And I think that's why it's so important that we really do give a little bit more thought to those that we look past in our daily work. The fifth reflection, mobilizing and aligning finance in support of the SDGs. The debate around financing the 2030 agenda has evolved considerably over the past 4 years. More partners are engaged and many more new initiatives have emerged. At the same time, there are significant gaps and the resources are not coming in time. The SDG financing gap for developing countries is more than $920 billion a year. That's one estimate. Private investment in developing countries remains static. Global investment remains overwhelmingly directed towards short-term gains, and they're not necessarily aligned with the SDGs. It is an ambitious framework, and what we've seen many people do is actually MDGs plus. So a little bit more than the last set of goals, and that's just not enough. So we need to start seeing change that has real impact. We need to step up the work on domestic resource mobilization. At the same time, we need for those commitments made to ODA to happen and to leverage the domestic resources. And we need to see a greater proportion of that ODA going to the most vulnerable of developing countries. We did a recent piece of work with the IMF on costing the SDGs in our least developed countries, finding that you would need 15% of GDP to get anywhere near them. That, we all know, makes it almost impossible for any of our LDCs, our low-income countries, to succeed with the SDGs. And so we need work that's aimed at aligning the global financial system with the 2030 agenda, and that needs to start delivering on major change. The context is a very big issue for us on financing. Many of our countries don't have the necessary governance frameworks or perhaps even the regulatory frameworks today, but they could have tomorrow with the necessary capacity and technical assistance. Perhaps what is more of a challenge is the context of crises, whether it is conflict, humanitarian, climate. This makes it a much more difficult environment in which to try to deliver on the SDGs. The Secretary General's Task Force on Digital Financing, we believe, can play a key role. Its initial findings have identified several ways in which fintech can shift the center of gravity in the financial system towards ordinary people. We've seen lots of initiatives taken in East Africa connecting mobile money to people. In fact, I understand today that in China, cash is no longer a means of paying for goods and services. That's all done online. So the future is very different from what we have today. The Secretary General's Alliance on Global Investors for Sustainable Development, just launched last month, will also deliver clear recommendations and initiatives to supply long-term financing for sustainable development. All too easy for the short-term development, but not for the long-term. And financing for critical infrastructure is about long-term risk. Sixth and finally, engaging in the science and technology community. Science and technology, we know, can be powerful agents for change in achieving the SDGs. It's one of the key messages of the 2019 Sustainable Development Report. But we're still behind on many targets related to knowledge and education. For example, in 2015, an estimated 617 million children and adolescents of primary and lower secondary school age did not have a minimum proficiency in reading and math. That's children going through education, but education not passing through them, not even with the basic skills that will allow them to go further. Education, including higher education and lifelong learning, we know has a critical role. STEM education, for example, is key to tackling some of the critical challenges like the climate solutions that we look for and the biodiversity loss. Broader support for our developing countries that lack science capacities and infrastructure will be essential if we're to strengthen that connection between science and policy. Friends, colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen, moving from policy to impact to succeed in implementing the 2030 Agenda will need all actors and all people on board in all constituencies, not just government, but in every one of our constituencies. It needs a united front to try to lift, because this is pretty heavy. Next September, the UN celebrates 75 years of its existence, and the SG will convene the first platform for the Decade of Action so that we, year on year, going to 2030, can show the world the direction of travel in trying to achieve the SDGs. It'll help us understand at which point we are in every region, in every country, cross-border and communities. It'll show where we're on target and where a lot more needs to be done. It will provide a snapshot of what's working and what isn't, and help us to understand what we need to do more. I look forward to Qatar's participation. I know that we have our permanent representative here, Sheikha Alia, who's co-facilitating that whole UN at 75. And maybe just here to say that at 75, what's the UN you envisage? And ask that as a question to those who know what the UN is, but be very respectful and humbled by the fact that so many don't know. That global town hall for the global village, what should it be doing? What are your expectations of that space to try to ensure that we keep peace and we have prosperity, moving together and ensuring that the legacy of the 2030 Agenda happens in the lives of our children and builds the foundation for the 21st century and onwards. I look forward to having our discussion as we go forward in the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Secretary General, for that great lecture. A message of urgency. We need to start seeing change now. Walk with me. We're going to take a seat and have a conversation now with the Deputy Secretary General. You can sit here if you would like. Yes. And this is your microphone. Thank you. It was a very informative lecture. I think another round of applause for the Deputy Secretary General. There's a lot to talk about, obviously, but I think everyone here wants to know a bit more about you, Amina Mohammed. You've been named one of the greatest female leaders in the world today. What's it like for a woman, a Muslim woman of color, to navigate the halls of the United Nations?
Okay. Is this where I tell the truth?
Yes.
Okay.
And nothing but the truth.
Nothing but the truth. No, actually, it's a wonderful place. I think being a woman of color is just adding to the diversity of the UN, and the UN is such a diverse place. You walk down the corridor and you do see, 5 regions, 193 countries as you walk past each and every one. But I think what's more difficult is that today, the perceptions of women of color, the perceptions of a Muslim woman are sort of defined outside the halls, and therefore you have to do so much more on the inside to project what is about a woman of color and a Muslim. One example, I come from Nigeria. I come from the northeast of Nigeria, and I went to primary school where Boko Haram was birthed. And so often the narrative of Boko Haram is as though terrorists are born, right? We didn't have Boko Haram. I went to school and I ended up being the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. So something was right in Maiduguri at one time. And we need to ask the question, what was it that created that perfect storm that gave us Boko Haram?
Right.
And that's the real question. And so when I see, I don't see the challenges so much, but the opportunities of who and what I am to try to make the case.
And so how do you feel your path has prepared you for the role of Deputy Secretary General, and more importantly, as a steward of the successful global implementation of the very ambitious SDGs?
I think very well. I mean, my whole life journey has been about solid steps in one constituency or another, whether it's the private sector, being an activist, working in education. And I think probably the best steps that I took were the work that I did with the Millennium Development Goals in my own country, that got me the reputation such that I could be part of the team that shaped the SDGs. So I think all along, the networking, the different constituencies, working with parliaments, which I see as a general assembly, working with bureaucracies in government, which are much like the one that we have with international bureaucracy. So it has prepared me very well, and I use my journey and my experiences to further that and to lead.
Yeah, and in February, it'll be, 3 years since you became UN Deputy Secretary General. Can you share with the audience here some of the accomplishments, one or two at least, that you're most proud of? I know it's always very difficult to choose.
Let me say, I mean, accomplishments as part of a team, because, you know, our number one feminist is the Secretary General. Sometimes I wish I could take credit for what he does for women, but, you know, he opens up the space, and so I think the first thing that we feel so proud of is that we now have parity in management and in the resident coordinators that are in 130 current countries around the world. So women are equal to men in the UN on those two levels. That, I think, is amazing. Perhaps the second most important thing for me is that for the first time in our history, we had working with us on the 38th floor, which is the Secretary General's floor at the top of the United Nations, a person living with disabilities. That's never happened. And I take great pride in that, because finally we put our mouth where our words were, and came true for the convention to begin with.
And something that's also never happened, Amina Mohammed, in 75 years of the UN's existence, is a female Secretary General. When can we expect that?
Very soon.
Inshallah.
Very soon, inshallah. I mean, the next Secretary General should be a woman. I mean, I think we tried last time, and we got a feminist. That's okay. Next time it has to be a woman, top to tail. And I hope that you will all support that. We will find the best to do it.
Your lecture focused, of course, on the Sustainable Development Goals. The list of 17 SDGs has some very lofty goals, including eliminating poverty, hunger, ensuring equitable quality education, promoting gender equality, and climate action, of course. Which of these goals will be the most challenging to achieve by 2030? Because 2030 is just around the corner, of course.
I mean, I think all of them have got huge challenges, and they are what we say is one. People often say, which one is your favorite, or, you know, as you've just asked me now. But it's like my kids. Every single one of them is incredibly special, but together they are it. And I think that if I was to really put my finger on it today, I would say the goal on inequality. I think that's going to be the most difficult one to challenge. It is pervasive, and it is through all the goals. And I think that that's probably the nut to crack.
Well, let's focus on the United Nations now itself. In January of this year, 3 years after the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development took effect, the UN began implementing a set of systematic changes that your boss, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, described as, I quote, the most significant structural change process in the history of the United Nations. So how exactly is the UN changing, and why?
It has to change. I mean, we put a huge framework out there, a huge new agenda that is transformational in what it wants to do in the world, and yet we found that the UN itself was not fit for purpose. In other words, the skill sets and the profiles and the abilities and capabilities in the UN were for another era. And what we needed to do is to change that. And so therefore, that full-scale reform on management, on peace and security, on development is what took place. But so too, looking at what are our greatest assets, which are our people, seeing that, you know, their own well-being was taken care of, both in the field and headquarters, that young people were part of this, so bringing in more young people, trying to ensure that we had gender parity through the system and not just in the management. Looking at issues that for a long time have been overlooked, and that's of mental health. It's also of sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment, bringing an end to that so that you really did invest in the rights and well-being of your people. From the inside out, we're able then to have a voice and a collaboration with countries today. It's no longer about a prescription and telling people what to do. It's about standing with them and in solidarity and ensuring that these frameworks can be implemented together.
Now, you talked about in your lecture a bit about the fact that maybe a lot of people don't know what the UN is and what the UN does. During the recent Paris Peace Forum, Qatar Foundation's Doha debates held a discussion panel on the issue of the lack of public trust in institutions. And the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Raid Zadeh Hussein, said, and I quote, "If the UN does not quickly make itself relevant for much of the rest of the world, I think it's in danger of collapsing." So quite powerful from someone who's worked within the UN system. What's your response to comments like that, especially from somebody who knows the UN so well?
I think there are legitimate concerns by many people around the world that institutions are not being responsive. You're seeing many people on the streets today who have lost trust in institutions and governance, and there's plenty of reason to say they have legitimate concerns. It's one of the reasons why the UN is trying to reform. And I can talk about development on a day-to-day basis because that's what I engage with, and I think we will make those changes, and people are already better at responding at countries to those partnerships. But I think the UN really needs to think through what it was set up for. And that really was to keep the peace and to bring an environment for more prosperity and unity. So I think, yes, I think we do have to think. We have to think about what should the Security Council be doing in the next 75 years? How should it be reforming to address a response that the world so desperately needs when we look around and see the conflicts?
And how do you precisely reform in the current fractured world that we're living in, where the multilateral system is under attack, where isolationist actions by leading powers are becoming more commonplace? Is the relevance of the United Nations and the realizations of its 3 pillars of development, peace and security and management not under threat today? When you look at the bigger picture of the current world that we're living in, how do you reform in this context?
Yep, international cooperation is under threat. People are looking inwards, and what we have to do is to say no. There is a reality where there's a big pushback. There's climate change, which incidentally is man-made, and perhaps if more women were in decision-making positions, we wouldn't have so much disaster on the climate, on the planet. So I think that what we need to do here right now is to think about the reality and still the aspirations, which are very much front and center of everyone's mind. And there's a gap, and we just need to plug away at closing that gap. The UN, there is no platform in the world that brings together every voice. And those voices come in. Today they state their concerns, and sometimes they go with a solution, sometimes they don't. Our job is to continue to give hope and voice to the conversations that need to happen to bring people closer together. We didn't imagine that there would be a rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea a couple of years ago. Today there is.
Right.
There are many places that solutions are being brought to the table, perhaps not fast enough, and so therefore the urgency of us getting together is even more important.
But I want to pick up on the pushback that you talked about. Pushback from some of the most powerful countries in the world. The United States, for instance, has voiced its concerns about the UN publicly over the past few years. The US are your biggest financial contributor, but they're still not providing voluntary national review of efforts to implement the SDGs, I should say, and are in the process, in fact, of withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. So how can we expect to tackle the SDGs when the most powerful country in the world doesn't seem to be on board with them?
Well, fortunately for us, the UN goes on, right? So you have cycles of leadership. The people remain the same in their aspirations. And I think what you have to do is engage with leaders to try to make sense of where they stand and where perhaps they should with agreements and frameworks that their countries have signed on to, sometimes before they've come into office. We don't give up on the United States coming back into the fold on climate change because it's really important. They are a great contributor to emissions, and so we need to do something about that. But what we do see with our host country is that in spite of we continue to engage with the leader, we engage now with states, with business, with the communities, and they make a difference as well. So a country is often beyond a leader, and I think that that's what we have to remember. Engage with every part of it and continue to try to make it better, and I think that we can do. I think that
country
we've made changes.
is beyond the leader. That's an important message, I think.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Let's turn our attention to this region now, the Gulf region, before we bring in our audience for a few questions. Now, we're in a country, Qatar, whose growth is tied to oil and natural gas, of course, and Qatar is trying to build a nation that will eventually become a research-based state and diversify its economy. What recommendations do you have for Qatar as it makes its transition away from its heavy reliance on fossil fuels?
I think for Qatar, it will be important that they address many of the issues around a good energy mix. And I've seen in some of the cases, as I've walked through the stadium yesterday, that these efforts are being made to diversify that. And that's what they need to do. The NDCs, which are nationally determined contributions for the climate agenda, will be due in 2020. Countries have to make those NDCs a 1.5 degree world and not the 3.2, 3.4 degree world they currently are. Qatar is part of that. And so looking at their NDC and ensuring it becomes more ambitious will reduce that carbon footprint.
But what challenges does Qatar, can they expect to face, as you know, from your experience as a former Minister of the Environment, what challenges can they expect to face as they gear up to host the first ever carbon neutral World Cup?
Well, that footprint has to become greener.
Yeah.
Perhaps one of the issues there is to get to single-use, taking away single-use plastic overnight. How do you do that? I mean, this is a big population that's going to come, and to come into a country where they set standards for green would be amazing. So they still have a way to go, but I think that what they're doing is trying to travel that path. I think transitions are important, and we need to push urgency and ambition. But to remember there are transitions.
Right. All right, one last question before we bring in our audience. On the recent protests that we've seen around the world, whether it's in Lebanon, Chile, France, Iraq, there seems to be a prevailing breakdown of trust within and also between countries. And although they're different, these protests and riots, they have a common thread that links them together, and that is inequality, corruption, freedoms, and climate change, and so on. And we are in a region that's certainly experiencing its fair share of challenges. What can the UN do to ensure that its principles, the principles and values of the United Nations, are leading to more social cohesion, stability, and also shared prosperity?
I think one of the greatest assets we have is the ability to convene, and to convene around these issues in places that will make a difference, to bring in people that can help to make the changes. I mean, leaders have to listen to what is happening on the street. It's important. They're no longer, in many cases, representing a population that has different aspirations and are faced by very many concerns and challenges, as you say, of inequality. So they have to listen. We need to provide that space. We need to amplify some of the issues that we have to deal with. Part of the delivering on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs is about the rule of law, justice, and governance, and it's really important we get that right. It's the enabling environment, it's the strength of the fabric of our societies, and that needs to happen. The UN convenes to do that. It does it regularly, but it perhaps needs to go out further and do it in the regions, do it in countries. Where we have a resident representative, they shouldn't be waiting for the General Assembly once a year. The UN can convene country by country where it is present.
All right. Deputy Secretary General, let's now turn to our audience and get them to join in on our conversation. And ladies and gentlemen, we're of course very keen to have as many of you ask questions, but I would like, please, if you can, to keep your questions to just one, keep them short, and also keep it, if you can, to the theme of the lecture today. So let's see, we have quite a few hands raised. Let's start with the gentleman with the red tie over there. Yes.
Hi, firstly, just want to say thank you and welcome to Doha from Doha College. We've seen each other a few times. So firstly, just want to say, I mean, apart from spreading awareness and demonstrating, what can we say to young people to make a practical difference to making our Sustainable Development Goals a reality?
Each of us have a role to play. As you said, it's not just the governments and institutions, but what can we as individuals do to make a difference?
There's no silver bullet, but the first thing is get that education, because it's the most powerful tool that you'll ever have. The second is to use it with voice. I mean, we've seen young people use voice at the United Nations that's made leaders very uncomfortable and start to take action in their own countries. So don't ever lower the volume on your voices. You need to make it. However, voices need to be constructive. You need to find a place where these will land and where actions can be taken. So connecting that voice to the actions that need to be taken, sometimes they're in the halls of the General Assembly, sometimes they're in your parliaments. And sometimes it's just through the actions that you decide to do as a consumer or a shareholder in market. So if tomorrow you decided you were not going to use plastics, there would be a big problem for the industry. They would have to find an alternative. And I think that you do remember the power of your voice, the power of the choices you make individually and collectively make impact. With the SDGs, look, there are 17 SDGs, but it's about an economy. It's also about the partnerships and what we do in terms of looking at the environment that we live in, and the basic justices that people are that people ought to pay attention to. You leave young people leave school and take on a job. The job that you do, what is it in that job that you can contribute to actually achieving the SDGs? Don't wait to be told to implement them. Implement them in your daily life, in your daily work, and in the voice that you have to carry into corridors or places that others don't have access to. Many young people today are privileged when you have an education. There are many more that don't. So the other thing I would say to the youth constituency is to reach to those of you that don't have in that constituency, because you're so much more powerful. We've seen this fracture between the haves and have-nots in the youth community. And I think that needs to be strengthened, and that would be a powerful place to be. In my country, when we wanted to complete the survey for the world we wanted with the SDGs, it was amazing to see educated young Nigerians who had technology actually go into the communities and get the voices of their fellow youth into that survey. It was the largest survey that was done worldwide. So, leverage and use that voice and much more with actions in your lives.
Yeah, that was a group, by the way, of the MUN students from Doha College. So future United Nations leaders, maybe, who knows, right?
Well, yeah, I'm sure there's a number of Secretary Generals there that are women.
Yes. All right, another question, well, from one of the students. Let's see the young lady in the middle, please.
So thank you and good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to thank you for your beautiful talk, especially when you talked about your journey as a person of color and specifically as a woman of color moving up into the United Nations. So I would like to ask what measures are being taken by the UN in order to achieve true inclusivity when it comes to young people and specifically young people of color, like a lot of us here.
That's a very good question.
Thank you.
That's a great question. That's why we want young people at the forefront. Well, I mean, the inclusivity piece is really about the way and manner in which we recruit. We found when we wanted to get gender parity that there were many, many obstacles to that in the way in which we advertised, the forms that were filled out. In fact, today, I have a big challenge with, on the one hand, we don't make it obligatory for someone with disabilities to put that on their form. On the other hand, we want them in the system. So how do we, square that circle? And on the other hand, we do have a principle and a policy for geographical representation. And that's something that we paid much more attention to because it wasn't there before. So even though we have parity, not necessarily do we have the geographical representation, and we make a big push to see that. Diversity is our strength and not our weakness, and so we try to put that through. On young people, whoa, okay. So that's much more difficult. Women have a glass ceiling. I would say currently in the UN, probably young people have got a concrete one. But we do have a body of young people called Young UN, and they are pushing because the SGs opened up that space, opened up the space to our youth envoy to say, please be disruptive. And try to shake up the tables that we have that take the decisions for you without you, and to make sure that you're always there, even if it is just one person. The Secretariat, where we have sway over not all the agencies, funds, and programs, but the Secretariat, we're trying the best that we can to reduce the age. The average age of entry into the UN as Secretariat is as young as 45. So it's, and then we just had a policy that, took our pensions. I think we retire longer now, right, Ambassador Alia? So we've got us for a little longer, and I think we need to change that. And we are struggling, but we are trying to make sure that not only do we get parity, that we get young people in as well.
All right. Another question. Let's try this side of the room and the young lady in green. Can we get her a microphone that works, please?
Young people have loud voices.
Hello, we're not off to a good start with the microphone, and I'm a bit shaky, but I will try to make my questions as short as possible. I came here because I was very interested in what you had to say. I've never been to something like this, but because of what's going on in my country recently, I felt it personally has something to do with me. I'm Lebanese, actually, so when you asked about the situation that's going on, you said that we have to make the government listen. Well, I'm Lebanese, and I'm telling you, they're not listening. When they don't listen, when we can't find a solution, what can actually be done? I mean, we are doing what we can. We are going to the streets, or my people are living here. We are doing what we can. We are giving our demands, but they don't want to listen because they are so corrupted that they want to keep the status quo. And I personally believe, I'm not a political person, but I will tell you what I know from my humble knowledge, is that the great countries, they want to keep the status quo. It's not in their best interest to change things. Because also another point,
let's let her answer that first question.
Okay,
Yes?
sure. Can I sit down?
Yes, you can sit down. Thank you so much. That's a great question, actually. And she's speaking from the heart, you can tell, from her own experience. What do you do when governments are not listening to the voices of their people?
So first, shaky voice is no problem, because I know now that, young people have always said to me, we want authenticity, credibility, and so if you read a really nice speech, don't believe you. But if your voice shakes, we do. Yes. I think what the Lebanese public, young people are doing by coming out on the street peacefully to demonstrate about an end to what they see as corruption and bad governance is amazing. But the truth is that you're in a push-button era, but change doesn't come by pushing a button or having coming out on the street for a week or 2 weeks. Sometimes it takes months and years to make that change. What you don't do is give up. You believe in that change. There are enough of you. Leaders begin to listen because they know they can't come out their doors. I do think change happened in Lebanon. I mean, the Prime Minister stepped down, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So change may not be at the scale at which you want it overnight, but just look at what little of the glass has started to fill up just because you went out on the streets to say enough is enough. And don't ever underestimate that, because around the world it's happening. In one Sunday that I woke up, 5 countries went down in one region. And some of those countries succeeded in making the change they wanted, not only the president or the prime minister stepping down, but in fact they got the constitution addressed. And I think that happens. So it is about the journey. If I've learned anything in my life, is that at your age, I wanted everything to happen yesterday. And suddenly understanding that, somebody had told me my first job would be 11 years before I moved, I would have said to them I didn't want the job. But it did, and that journey of 11 years allowed me to do the next 5 years even better, and to get to where I am today. I never looked for a career in the UN. I looked to make a difference in my country. And just, every step, every difference that you make counted as a really strong stitch as you try to mend the social fabric of your society, the governance of your society. Never give up on telling a leader that what you voted them into office is what they have to hold sacred. You should, I mean, maybe I'm not supposed to say that as a Deputy Secretary General, but I really believe that leaders are there to serve their people.
Yes.
And if they're not serving their people and they don't listen as you go through the right routes of Parliament or wherever your voice is heard, then you end up on the streets. Just make sure you're loud and consistent and persistent until the changes are made. And do it in the most peaceful and powerful way that you can, because leaders eventually listen. Eventually they do. We have lots of them have stepped down.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to allow somebody else to ask the question. Thank you. That was a great question. Thank you so much. Let's see the gentleman in the middle. Is that Dohal College again? Come on. In the middle here, please.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you so much for your inspiring speech and giving us this honorable opportunity. So in 2005, you were given the charge of coordinating the Nigerian Debt Relief Fund, and you implemented these amazing strategies such as the Virtual Poverty Fund, which tackle the MDGs. And what do you think are the most detrimental effects of debt within a country, especially when looking at factors such as poverty or achieving gender inequality?
We were talking, last week I was in Senegal talking about debt sustainability with the IMF. And I think one of the things we came to the conclusion is that not all debt is bad. It's how it's structured, what it's used for, and whether in fact it makes any impact. In the case of Nigeria, it was pretty bad debt, badly negotiated, incredibly expensive, and took its toll because we didn't have the fiscal space after paying back. And so that negotiation was amazing. They did condition the debt. It had to be used on the MDGs, and that's why we got, in that $1 billion saving, the ability to leverage our domestic resources to do it. So I think my advice always is that developing countries like ours, we need debt, but we need it at good rates, we need it on time, at scale, and the capacities and regulatory environments to make sure we use it correctly, and not to take it for the many projects that I can say are littered across the world that shouldn't have been.
Okay. We're going to take one or two more questions at the most because we unfortunately are running out of time. Let's see the lady, yes, right here with the very pretty top.
Thank you very much. Thank you for
Dress,
this
yes.
opportunity. My name is Nadia Chernovil. I'm an artist and curator of IQ Targets art project, the Smart Targets. And this year we did the art exhibition Sustainable Art here in Qatar with a Green Building Foundation. And I would like to say that art is a great tool to reach people and to put seed in the young generation of people. And my question is it possible to reach some kind of, let's say, art department, and celebrate this life in the 75th anniversary next year with the United Nations all over the world through the art initiatives? Thank you.
Absolutely, anything's possible. And don't let anybody tell you there isn't. Yes, there is. There is a conversation now with the UN through one of our colleagues, Fabrizio Rothschild, and I think we will share all that information. And it's his job to curate initiatives and ideas like this and to make them work from the beginning of next year all the way through to December when we take up the UN at 75. And art, culture is a central part of what we need to get right.
Great.
How to connect?
Let's
Okay,
speak
I'll give you a
afterwards.
card before
Yeah,
I
we'll
leave.
take one last question. The gentleman in the middle there, please.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. My name is Osric Nafti. I'm an obstetrician, born in Cameroon, trained in the UK, working in Doha. So you can see my journey there. And I think one of the things that I'd like to express particularly gratitude to the United Nations and to yourselves is the work that you've done in terms of maternal mortality. And that's a perfect example of what Focusing Minds has achieved worldwide. I trained also in Nigeria, so I am sort of Nigerian in that respect. And I know the figures in terms of maternal mortality and how over the last 10, 15 years, there's a massive, massive difference it has made. So I think on behalf of the women that we serve, I think it's really important to say thank you for the work that you do. We have a little input into it, but by developing that policy, that Focus Minds, we've been able to save our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, and make a big difference. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Shall we take just one last question before we go? Yes, the gentleman. Yes, okay, we can take three and then she'll answer all of them
No, it's
together.
3. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for the beautiful speech. I'm Dr. Redwan. I'm a specialist in sustainability and background in engineering. I work in the state. I'm now here in Doha. My question is with regard to the 17 factors of sustainability. There are some challenges, especially in the Gulf in general, which regard to the carbon dioxide emission and how to decrease these impacts. So based on your experience, what could be the factor that can help us to mitigate these issues beside maybe regulations?
Okay, that's one question. Let's take another one. Yes, the gentleman here in the blue tie. It's not working.
Thank you for the compliment. Yeah, thank you, madam, for the beautiful lecture. I just want you to explain some things to us. As a former minister in Nigeria of environment, I want to know what the UN is doing about multinational companies and their contribution to environmental degradation. If we take, for example, Niger Delta in Nigeria, the local people are not able to embark on their daily activities because of pollution. So is the United Nations scared of these multinational organizations because of their contributions, donations, or what are you doing to checkmate their activities, to limit their contribution to environmental degradation?
Thank you for your question. Do you want to answer that before we take on one last question, or should we take one more question then? Yes, the lady in the back there. And that will be the last one, please.
So first of all, thank you for your speech. So we all know that the UN is a great organization, but I mean this in the nicest way possible. It's not entirely perfect. So how are the SDGs specifically working towards fixing the UN's past mistakes? You know, things that happened maybe 20, 30 years ago that are still affecting people to this day.
Like
Like the Srebrenica genocide, for example, or the Rwandan genocide, where the UN kind of neglected
failures,
them.
past UN failures, how are those being?
Yeah, the UN neglected them, and people are still facing the impacts this day.
I think the UN continuously, in the work that we do, tries to make sure those things never happen again. Most recently, what we've done is to put in place a hate speech policy, which has seen many governments take it up. Some, like in the case of my country, home government, not done it in the best way, but at least try to put checks and balances in trying to stop what we recognized were the root causes at that time. Those early signals are what we have put in place to try to ensure that it never happens again. I mean, that I think is what we learn. We learn it from cholera in Haiti, from the tragedy in Srebrenica, from what, again, as you see, the challenge being taken up in the Hague, with Gambia taking Myanmar to the Hague. So it's a continuous effort to make sure that it never ever happens again, and that those communities that have been affected, that we work with government, we work with other partners to better those lives. And the SDGs frame that. The difference between the MDGs and the SDGs, it's a global agenda now. It's no longer just for the South. It is about everyone. And I think that's been the most challenging, is that people don't often think that. They've talked about development for so long, looking down and rather than looking in the mirror. And I think that's helped us with some of the voluntary national reviews that we've had to see how to better help countries, particularly in Europe, Eastern Europe. It's still a work in progress, but that's why we have the decade, urgent, and do it now. Niger Delta.
Yes.
As a Minister of Environment, the one thing I realized was that with every conflict that I dealt with, environment was critical. So in the Niger Delta, what we tried to do was that there was a UN report that brought to the fore what needed to be done to deal with the Ogoni tragedy. And that, at least in my time, and it wasn't a very long time, so where you're very forceful and dedicated to trying to get something done with the people, with government, it gets done. And that particular issue we did raise. Now, we were negotiating with one of the multinationals, and what we were trying to ensure was that they put the money that they had committed to on the table. They did. They didn't want to, but they did. And I think that had a lot to do with the evidence that was produced by the UN in order to reinforce the decision making. But let me say that in the Niger Delta, one of the key issues that has to be addressed is those multinationals would not be in the country if not government. So everyone has a role to play. And I think that what people should be doing is asking their government to protect them from multinationals that are clearly doing damage. And that I think has to be taken up in a much more forceful way. My experience from the Niger Delta is that state governments, local governments have to do more to ensure that these agreements that we go into protect people and don't damage the environment. So it's not just the UN. There are many stakeholders that need to be involved in ensuring that multinationals do what they're supposed to, do right by people and not off their backs. The first question was about if you take I don't know if you've looked at the nationally determined contribution for the Paris Agreement for Qatar. That's one place to start, because what it will do is generate a pipeline of projects that will reinforce the transition to a green economy. And that's really what needs to be done. Now, in that, you can unpack all sorts of work for you and your career for life, because there's so much that can be done. There are so many opportunities that can be taken. I think as a Minister of Environment, the first thing we did was to actually have a green bond. That green bond allowed us to invest in solar energy. So, there are possibilities, and that's what we need to engage the government. What is their plan for transitioning to a green economy? What's the energy mix today? What is it going to be in order to get to a 1.5-degree world over the next decade or so?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Deputy Secretary General, for your time. Unfortunately, we have to leave it here, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Education City Speaker Series and Qatar Foundation, I'd like to thank once again the Deputy Secretary General for her contribution today, for really sharing your remarkable experience with us, for all that you do to make the world into a better place. And a big thank you to our audience here for the incredible turnout, of course, and also for your participation. Thank you to the Qatar Foundation and Education Speaker Series. Shukran. Thank you.
Check. Hey.
Ahmed. Ahmed. Excuse me, brother. Thank you. Boss. You know why it's not transmitting? Can you see it now? Because you put it on in. You put it on in. It's okay. Yep. Joseph, take. It's very heavy. Very heavy. And it was not fit properly. Not good.
Oh, it can't sit down.
Yeah. You can put it there. Just